Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending, of course, where you are. Really glad to open this final session of Next Innovation Week, which was a quite hectic week in overall, with interesting title, Can Technology Improve Patient Centricity? What have you learned from COVID-19? I'm actually would like to welcome 4 extraordinary speakers. You will see and hear from them later on. Gabriela will kindly introduce them. And at this stage, I would like to pass the stage to Gabriela. Gabriela, the stage is yours. Please proceed with this interesting session.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to have you today and be in conversation with you. We do hope this is a conversation, so please feel free to enter your questions in the question chat, and we will be taking them throughout the session. So we are going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves, and we're going to ask if you could please answer the question that the title poses, can technology improve patient centricity? What have we learned from COVID-19? So if you could just say a word about who you are and what you do, and then answer that question as way of introduction, that would be wonderful. And Tim, can we start with you?
Yes, hi, Gabriella, thank you very much. Hello to everyone. My name's Tim Ringrose. I'm a doctor from Oxford in the UK, and I'm Chief Executive Officer of Cognizant Group, which is a company that delivers health information using visual and immersive techniques and a system for clinicians to provide information prescriptions to patients. And in answer to the question, one of the unexpected consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic has been a rapid surge in the adoption of digital technology in health. Healthcare systems around the world have for years been dipping their toe, figuratively, in the water of digital technology, and the pandemic has forced us really to throw ourselves into the water like a mad dash, perhaps even not remembering to take off your clothes before jumping into a swimming pool. But what's most important, though, is that digital technology has delivered results. And this has happened very quickly, particularly in countries like China and Korea, where the population have quickly complied and adopted new systems and embraced the technology. And some of this, I'm sure, is down to the fact that in those countries, the population is more compliant and does what the government tends to ask to do. But I think it's also because the technology is easier to use and more effective, and we've seen so many improvements. And the smartphone is one of the critical factors for this. So I really think we ought to consider the smartphone as one of the most important medical devices that we have.
Great, wonderful, Tim. Thank you so much. Jen, can we come to you and ask you to introduce yourself and share your thoughts on the question?
Sure, thanks so much for having me. I am Jen Horanchuk, founder and CEO of Savvy Cooperative. And Savvy is a little bit different. We're actually the first and only patient-owned public benefit co-op that works with companies or innovators to help them actually understand the patient experience. And I care about this because I am a patient. I have grown up since an infant with multiple chronic illnesses, notably juvenile idiopathic arthritis and lots of other autoimmune conditions, including a brain tumor that was removed 7.5 years ago. So I certainly have a patient lens. I'm a human factors engineer and human-centered designer by training, a recovering academic that was really studying patient-centered outcomes in treatment guidelines and clinical trial outcome measure sets to make sure that we're including things that matter to patients. And so when it comes to the conversation about whether or not technology is improving patient centricity, I do believe it has a lot of potential, but I don't think we're there yet. And my sort of lens is that there was so much of a rush to deploy so much of this during the pandemic that we've skipped doing some of the due diligence that we really need to do and go back and think critically about to make sure we're not leaving people out of that innovation process. As we talk about technology, we have to understand the health inequities that I know we'll get to speaking about. But I think, again, it's setting the stage for a lot of potential, but if we don't do the work in a really thoughtful manner, it has actually the potential to further divide those companies who are doing the work right and those who are not.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. And Charlotte, welcome.
So my name's Charlotte Fairweather. I'm a general practitioner and sports medicine consultant by trade in the UK. And I come from a world where I've worked in the National Health Service and then moved into an elite world working in sport at international level, where digital technology has been used widely for quite some time. And I'm in a world of medical affairs where I can take that clinical experience and expertise and vision and move it into a place where potentially we have the resources available to focus on patient needs and wants and how we can really optimize that space. So I truly believe if used with focus and care and real thought behind it, that digital technology and telehealth can improve patient centricity. But if used in the wrong manner, it could go too far the other way and actually have completely the opposite effect. So what have we learned from COVID? We've learned that we can do it, and actually those areas of medicine where historically they've been a little bit resistant to this technology can embrace it, and they can utilize it, and they can utilize it well. It's now how we take that and move forward in a really valued fashion that ensures that patient focus stays at the forefront.
Great, wonderful, thank you so much. So we look forward to diving into these themes. And let's start, if we can, Tim, with you. Can you talk a little bit about...
Gabriella?
Yes.
Yes. This is Loda. You cannot see me, but I can see and hear you.
Welcome, Loda, our fourth panelist. It's wonderful to hear you. Thank you so much. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi. Thank you very much. My name is Loda de Wolf. And quickly to catch up with the discussion, I agree with Tim that the phone is a lifesaver. I have not been able to join this web conference if it weren't for my phone, because 2 laptops were not working. And I totally also agree with both Charlotte and Jen that the potential is huge. And I would specify a little bit that we have with digital the potential to move each and every step of both the medical process, the patient experience, and the drug development. But what we have learned with COVID is good things and bad things. As Charlotte said, yes, we can do it much faster than and against resistance that existed. But we've also learned already, and we have now data which should help us, what not to do, which comes back to what Jen said and what Charlotte said.
Great. Thank you so much and welcome. Glad you're here. Thank you for persisting. So let's pick up this question of inequity. It seems to be a hot one, and we'll work our way through to other ones. But Jen, during the pandemic, we saw this wide support for telemedicine. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges related to inequity during this pandemic time, but in general as well?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think, when we think about what happened with the pandemic and rolling out things like telemedicine, it really felt like in March and April, it was a bunch of people giving each other high fives for solving the problem, and we've done it. To Charlotte's point, that we proved that we can. But I think it does leave people out, and it's not just access to the technology itself. We're actually working with an organization that's working to deploy smartphones to other underserved populations that didn't have access to technology, so they can do telemedicine. But here's the thing, not everybody is in a situation where they may be comfortable speaking about certain stigmatized conditions from the confines of their home. When I talk about this, I point out that I have a nice clean background behind myself, but certain populations may be living with multiple people in a very small space. They may be uncomfortable and ashamed by what is behind them. They may want to turn their camera away, and to the clinicians on the line, I'm sure you can attest to how having sort of that connection and reading cues is different from if somebody is uncomfortable. So I think that there are many things that we need to take into consideration beyond technology. And what are people really comfortable with engaging in sort of that manner? And also asking the question of, does it have to be video? Is it something that can be done just doing, on a phone call? As we see with Loda right now, despite his, tech savviness and ability to try 2 different laptops and a phone, still isn't able to do it. And that's where there can be friction against it. And there just are people that are still, facing challenges adopting some of this technology. All this being said, I'm a huge proponent for it because it can democratize things. We know that, people, I'm here in the States, but people here in the middle of the country don't always have the same access to large medical centers. So can we actually help get them better care by allowing them to talk to clinicians that they might not be able to travel to and see? And I think another aspect, and we're seeing this a lot in mental health, is the ability to then connect with a clinician or provider who maybe has more similar values or can understand your experiences more. I don't know if you know much about the United States right now, but there is a lot of divisiveness. And so therefore, just connecting with people that see more eye to eye. So I've heard a lot in sort of our patient network about people who are now talking to counselors or therapists in either, maybe a major city, even though they're in a rural area, because they feel like that person understands them and, kind of their perspective better. So I do think that there's a lot of ways that we can actually democratize some of the healthcare that was not accessible to certain types of patients before, but with the caveat that if we don't do so thoughtfully and make sure that we're thinking about the underserved, then we can really deepen the divide.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Charlotte, Jen started the conversation a little bit about talking about the human side of medicine. And I would love it if you could talk a little bit about how we might preserve that human side of medicine in a telehealth world. What does that look like? How do we do it? What are some of these key questions that Jen is referring to that we need to think through?
Yeah, of course. So I thought I'd give everyone a little bit about me, really, in keeping with the human side. So in fact, as it happened, 9 years ago exactly today, I found myself in an anaesthetic operating theatre saying goodbye to my son. He just suffered a large stroke at 3 days old and needed emergency to relieve the pressure from his head. And as he weighed just over 3 pounds at the time, he was one of the smallest babies to ever undergo such a procedure. And what I can tell you from that is that I can vividly, even 9 years on, recall the expressions on the faces of the staff. I can remember the anaesthetist asking me, if there was anything, if I had any questions, and me replying, just don't let my baby die. And I can remember seeing his face and the fear and the anxiety and the sadness. And he did his best, as did the rest of the team. And my son's now 9, and although he has some complications as a result of this event, to all intents and purposes, he's an extraordinary little boy. And actually, we as a family experience daily how health technology can dramatically improve the quality of lives. And my point here is that this represents the really gritty, raw human side of medicine. It's the reason why most of us healthcare professionals go into the profession. It really is a vocation, it's not a job. And I know that's a bit of a cliche. So I hope we don't ever get to a point where these kind of interactions are ever done in anything less than face-to-face. And if we go back 40 years ago, doctors all knew their patients, their children and their grandchildren, and they probably even delivered them. They knew their stresses, their anxieties, etc. And if we jump forward, populations have grown exponentially across the globe, and the demand on healthcare professionals has changed and arguably increased. And the sheer numbers of patients per doctor means that this level of personal touch is actually no longer feasible, yet the quality we deliver mustn't falter. So my mantra in life, generally speaking, is value, not volume. But within healthcare, we have volume in terms of sheer patient numbers, but we also have to provide value at the highest level. And I think COVID-19 unquestionably forced us at full speed, like Tim said at the beginning, into a world of telehealth, and it's given us very little chance to adapt. But I think most of us agree that in this instance, the motivation is fairly well justified. And I'm an enormous advocate of digital health technology and innovation, case in point that I'm here talking today. And I believe that it provides the ability to improve efficiency, safety, accessibility to healthcare, health education, and health information to areas far beyond where we may ever have believed possible. But we only have to look at the technology available to amputees, stroke survivors, etc., to see how life-altering it can be. But how can we ensure that we don't go too far in the digital age and in so doing lose human perspective? And I think that's the thing that maybe concerns certain healthcare professionals. And I think we all have a part to play here. So healthcare providers need to ensure that they don't place video consultation in place of face-to-face for those who find it difficult or stressful, and quite rightly pointed out. the most vulnerable need to be identified. And I know that we will all, unfortunately, likely fall into this category at some point in our life, as I did 9 years ago. And this group need to be given the option. And this is where I think telemedicine can really provide value. So to be able to give people choice when you can is a really wonderful thing. And I truly believe that. So to be able to provide those with the technology access to comprehensive, well-evidenced health information and allow them to make an informed choice or have an informed discussion with their healthcare provider, I think is absolutely where we should be headed. Mm-hmm. And in that way, we're combining the marvel of digital innovation with the insight and experience and expertise of a real human healthcare professional. Mm-hmm. We've long since moved away from that doctor-centered consultation, and although that definitely has a place, it's certainly not the norm when it comes to day-to-day family medicine. And I think giving people some ownership of their health and well-being is something that we do, and we do every day through wearables that allow people to see their activity levels, their heart rate, oxygen saturations, blood glucose. I could go on and on. And pharma and health tech companies are really seeing, I think, really starting to see value in this when it comes to data collection and improved medication delivery systems. Mm-hmm. And in fact, COVID arguably, due to the sheer potential patient numbers, forced people to take some responsibility of recognizing when they're not well, using parameters that historically only doctors would work with. And I think this has value. I think the more that people understand about their own health status, the better prepared they can be when things will inevitably go wrong. So I think giving people access to health education in mediums that they can access and understand will eventually provide huge value to both them and their healthcare provider. And it then allows for a much more meaningful and hopefully patient consultation than we've ever had before. So I think to round up, I believe that if we can get to a place where digital interaction and the balance between digital interaction and human contact means that we're almost going back to that time when doctors and nurses could take those extra few minutes if they really need it, then I really believe that we've been given an opportunity here to move into an era of disease prevention and personalised medicine, where the patient remains firmly at the centre of our focus.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlotte. Tim, so Charlotte's been talking about this sort of patient-centered consultation, patient-centered personalized medicine. Can you bring in the physician perspective a little bit and talk about how physicians might best integrate technology into patient care? For what purposes should technology be used? What purposes should it not be used? And we should really be relying on that interaction, that human interaction.
Well, I think what's clearly demonstrated all around the world is that the general public, citizens, are willing and ready to adopt technology for healthcare. So the slow progress that we've seen up until now, up until COVID, has been mainly down to healthcare systems, and I'm ashamed to say clinicians, from being reluctant to adopt technology. And it's sad to say that, over the years, I've heard many colleagues say things like, video consultations are no use. I need to have a patient in front of me to be able to properly assess them. There's been a lot of resistance to artificial intelligence. Clinicians would say, AI can never be as good as me because, you need years of experience to be able to pick up subtle signs. People don't follow patterns. There are always unexpected things. And I know I have sympathy for that. And some of this reluctance, I think, is very understandable. Because if you look over the last couple of decades, we've had technology sometimes forced onto healthcare that's actually done a very bad job. If you look at electronic medical records and a lot of clinical systems, they have been very poorly designed for the user, for the clinician, and they haven't delivered the value that they, quite frankly, should have done. I know many clinicians whose frustration with clinical systems is very high. They think that systems have in fact made them less efficient. And one of the tragedies of that is that a consultation between a doctor and a patient has often actually been hampered by the clinical systems that the clinicians have been asked to use. So that sometimes means that a doctor will spend less time actually looking at the patient or talking to the patient because they're spending time trying to navigate around a very clunky interface to find a lab result or to put some data into electronic medical records. So, I think that explains some of the reluctance for technology that exists. And quite frankly, I think that the providers of some of these legacy systems and the IT directors who try to force them on clinicians should probably be lined up and have rotten tomatoes or rotten eggs thrown at them, because they've really done a disservice, and it might have been better if we hadn't had those systems ever and we're starting from scratch now. But the revolution is here. As we said, COVID has really forced change, and physicians who might in the past have been very conservative and reluctant to adopt technology are now, gone the other way. They're now converts, and they're rapidly adopting and adapting technology to change the way they practice. And that's great to see. I don't know if you can show the graphic.
Yep, we sure can.
Gabriella, that'd be useful, because there are many technologies that are helping to revolutionize the way that doctors and other healthcare professionals interact with patients, and they're transforming the relationship between clinicians and patients, and that puts the patient, or has the potential to put the patient on a new footing, right in the center, elevating their importance and putting them in charge of managing their own health to a much greater degree. So I'd like to give a few examples. I'm not going to go around the whole of this graphic, but a few examples of how technology, I believe, is really enabling clinicians to deliver better care. So GPs in the UK and doctors in many other countries are now conducting over 70% of their consultation with patients using remote-based services. And in some practices, this is over 90%. Patients like it, and doctors like it. I've heard so many doctors say, this is great. This enables me to be so much more efficient. I can deal with things very effectively, and I can see that patients like it. Now, of course, not every consultation can be done remotely, but by doing things remotely, it enables clinicians to save time. And, as Charlotte was just mentioning, that perhaps could mean that they can spend more time with someone who needs a face-to-face consultation, which I know is difficult during COVID, but we expect to get through this pandemic into and out the other side. And the second thing is that doctors are now actually encouraging patients to buy devices like blood pressure monitors, pulse oximeters, ECG machines to monitor their own health. That's something we didn't see before now, and I think that's a trend that's really positive, because it's putting the measurement and the collection of clinical data in the patient's hands, and the patient's much more can control and see what's happening. Doctors are also starting to recommend apps to patients, which wasn't happening very much before, and that's helping patients to manage their own long-term conditions, and again know what's going on and be much more informed about the choices that they have and how they manage their health. On another level, robotic process automation is starting to be used to take over some of the really dull administrative tasks that need to go on. So, for example, processes can be automated so that when a lab result comes in or an email comes in, the data is extracted and put into the clinical record. So taking away a lot of the drudgery and admin that has really distracted clinicians from being able to focus on patients. And virtual reality is also being used. So we're probably all familiar with virtual reality being used to train surgeons and medical students and others, but virtual reality is also a great tool for training patients to help them understand more about their condition, their treatment, and the options that they have ahead of them. And artificial intelligence, the big one, I mentioned before that was resisted by clinicians, but what we're seeing is that it's a great tool to enable patients to have a greater role in their health. I don't know how many people on the call today have got an Apple Watch, but the Apple Watch's ability to be able to monitor your heart rhythm, use artificial intelligence to warn you if you've had an episode of AF is amazing. It means that a patient who would otherwise not have their arrhythmia detected can be alerted, that can be reported to a clinician, and they can take steps to avoid having a stroke. That's amazing. And finally, all these sort of tools are enabling clinical trials to be conducted differently. So I believe we're just at the start of seeing a shift for clinical trials from being the traditional trial center-based process to being home-based trials using all these sort of tools, remote monitoring, wearables, measuring biomarkers, etc., to really change the way that we identify and try and evaluate the pharmaceutical products that are going to make a big difference to people's lives. So, I think hopefully you've seen that I've explained that there are a number of ways that I believe technology is pretty much extending across all the interactions between clinicians and patients. But I think there are three important tests that we need to apply to all of these technologies before we sort of rush in and do things that we might later find are not as helpful as we hope. I think the first thing is that the services need to be trustworthy. We've got to make sure that we have a rigorous system for evaluating these technologies. We're quite used to having a very careful system for evaluating medical devices, and we need to extend that to these technologies so that we can be sure that the way that they are dealing with the data and the way that they are providing recommendations and information is properly thoroughly tested, and so that we can trust them. The second thing is quite simple, but I think very important. We need to ensure that these technologies and these services save time, particularly for that interaction between the physician and the patient. Of course, we need to save money, but saving time is the most important thing to enable us to deal with the growing population and the growing amount of long-term conditions that we see, as has already been mentioned. And the final thing, which relates, I think, to health inequalities, is that these services need to be personalised. We've all come across, I think, examples of technologies that have been developed that, for example, artificial intelligence that works very well for white middle-aged men. We've got to make sure that all these technologies work, for people of all shapes, all colours and cultures. And that's a very important third test that I think we need to apply to any technology, coming back to Jen's earlier points.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. There's a question from the audience that I want to put to the panel, which is, this person is curious about whether the panel has any thought on the power of the smartphone as a device. So Jen, can I start with you? Power of the smartphone as a device.
I mean, I think Tim was outlining before that, and what I also agree, that it does have a lot of potential and there's a lot there. I think part of it's to accessibility, what we see too from people who are starting to develop things on smartphones. A lot of them may start with iOS, meaning an Apple iPhone, which already is then separating those people who have access to it or not. So how are we making sure that we're including people that might be using Androids or other types of phones or things like this. So I think that from that standpoint, we need to think about it. I think, another thing that we didn't necessarily touch on, which also sort of ties back to what Tim was sharing in sort of his schema, was looking at even data flow. And so it's something that a lot of people are concerned about their data, and even with their phones, they don't necessarily always trust different apps because they don't know what's happening to them. I think this is really interesting around digital specifically, because it was, especially if we have smaller digital health companies that are now being acquired, this is something we have to wrestle with, is what does informed consent look like for a patient or participant to be using something? They're consenting to give their data to one thing, but they didn't know it was going to be bought and then used for other purposes. We know that this is something we've wrestled with in sort of the clinical trial space as well. Should we be using this type of data in other places? But yeah, I think if we look back at this sort of schema, one thing that I find always interesting is when we put the patient at the center, we know that that's not always how this actually works. And it's just a bunch of people sort of like as voyeurs in a zoo looking down at this person. But I think what's interesting here is if we look at the direction of the arrows, because in this case, it also exemplifies that we're just throwing a whole bunch of stuff at patients. And it's just like, here, patients take more and more things, and we don't actually know how they're all working together. And that's one of the big challenges is, wear this wearable and use this app, and here's a smartphone, and oh yeah, your health records don't talk to any of the other things. And this just puts more and more burden on the patient. And this is why my least favorite term in healthcare is non-compliance, because it puts the onus on the patient as if it's their fault when we have created all of these things most likely without ever actually talking to patients. And that is one of the big issues, especially when it comes back to health equity, is what are we doing to make sure that they fit in that person's life? And are we doing the work to talk to those diverse participants, or are you only talking to us? Please, let's acknowledge the fact that everybody on this panel is white, and so we can only share a certain perspective if we truly want to make sure that we are talking to diverse individuals. And then we really should have arrows going the opposite direction as well, because that's where the data is going. And do the patients actually know where that is? And are we being transparent with it so that they can, make their own decisions on whether or not this is something they want to participate in?
And the follow-up question, and Jen, let's have you take a pass at this, and then Tim, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too, and then we'll come to Lode, is does that mean, this is a part 2 of the question about the smartphone, does that mean that healthcare and pharma need to work more closely with telecom companies? And if so, who owns the data?
Well, the data ownership as somebody who runs a cooperative is something that I could nerd out on for a long time. However, in the interest of time, I'll say that I think that it just is about bringing multiple stakeholders to the table. So don't just talk to the telecom people, let's get some patients in the room as well and have everybody else represented so that we can understand what everybody's bottom line and goals are. And I think that that's just how we should do innovation to begin with, because we can't just be guessing what another party is looking for. So I cannot speak on behalf of a teleconference or telecom sort of stakeholder group, but I think it's just really imperative that we do the work to understand how all the parties can collaborate and have a win situation.
Great. Tim, thoughts on that, on the partnership between pharma and telecom and who owns the data?
Well, in some respects, I think that ship has already sailed, or that horse has bolted, whatever analogy you want to use, because data about us is already out of our control. Google knows more about us than our, wives, partners, and I don't mean that to be so trivial, but I think that the data has already gone out there. But looking at it more positively, there are a lot of people who've done things like use 23andMe, and if you actually bother to read the terms and conditions, it pretty much means that they can do what the hell they like with the data. But the fact of the matter is that most people are quite happy to trade data for services. So I think the conversation should be much more about what value are we giving people in exchange for them sharing their data, because at the moment I think that's an unequal equation, and that people's data is being used and no value is coming back. So turning to the question about pharma, my view is that actually people are generally quite happy to give a lot of data about themselves, so long as they know where it's going and how it's being used, and most importantly, what are they getting in exchange. And I believe that there's an opportunity for the industry to gather a lot more data if it's done in that way. And I think there's a role for third-party channels to be playing an important part of that, because GDPR and the regulation that's applied to the industry often actually make it very difficult for individual companies to collect a lot of personal data. And quite frankly, I've heard a lot of people in the industry saying, I don't want patient data, it's just too much, it's too hot, it's going to cause me problems. So I think there's a really important role for independent parties, that could be telecom providers, it could be network platforms, to be collecting the data and doing it in a way that patients are very comfortable with, and then passing on the analysis. Generally, that means anonymized analysis onto the pharmaceutical industry in a way that means that the industry can get the information it wants without necessarily having all that personal data. But to police all that and do that is a massive task, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have as we move into the next decade.
And I'll weigh in quickly just on the data aspect, since we do work with companies constantly about sharing patient data, and we actually refer to two different things: the data that belongs to the patients, which is more their PII, PHI, that are sort of their own personal data, versus the project data. And I think it's important to have the differentiator there, that if you're learning insights, you can take those collective insights and do whatever you want with them. But it's really important, because we get companies all the time that say, oh, well, just give us the patient's email and we'll take it from there. Like, we're not in the business of selling patient data. That is not what we do. So I think it is important for people to understand that there are different types of data, and we should really make sure that we're thinking about them in different ways.
That's great. Thank you. Loda, would love to get your voice into the conversation. You have cautioned before not to reduce technology or digital, and I'm putting that in air quotes, technology or digital, to telemedicine, that there are many other ways to think about technology being integrated into healthcare. Can you talk a little bit about what those ways are that technology can be integrated? And I think we've heard a little bit from Tim, but would love to hear your perspective as well. Loda, did we lose you? Or are you on mute?
I should be unmuted now.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, good. So listening carefully, yes, I agree with what was said by Jen and Tim and the others, because this is an interesting panel in the sense that we all seem to agree very, very, very much. We still also do make two big mistakes all the time, and I think Jen is the only one that pointed out to it. We still tend to generalize. We speak about data, and then Jen says, wait a minute, depends on which data. We speak about doctors, we speak about patients, we speak about industry. If there's one thing we've learned from the COVID experience so far, is that the uptake of, let's talk, for example, virtual consultations, which is just one form of telemedicine and today often used as if it's the same. So when it comes to virtual consultations, a majority of patients have indeed welcomed them, but don't forget that is in the absence of an alternative, right? It was either that or not seeing the doctor, which comes back to the point about wanting to see. What we've also seen that even in that case, after about 4 or 5 teleconsultations, a lot of chronic patients, more than 60%, say, look, I'm no longer satisfied. So what it means is that that's my first message. We have to stop generalizing, and we have to probably be more specific also in the questions about what is it we are talking about. And so I think in a lot of what we said, we were actually talking about virtual consultations with doctors or other healthcare professionals, because that is probably a part of the whole bigger part of digital, where indeed, thanks to COVID, we have seen a huge breakthrough, right? We have seen a breakthrough even, and this is again to be stressed, that breakthrough is very unequal geographically. Yesterday, we were at another meeting where a German patient testified that within her German village, 2 doctors were doing this and the other one was refusing it. That's in the same village and the same healthcare system with the same technology. So the diversity is big. And if that's one thing that we haven't touched upon, is that digital health and telemedicine and virtual meetings can actually increase the health inequity by leaving people more behind than they currently are already left behind. So that's just a comment on the fact we should really stop generalizing. So let me talk about a few other technologies that I think should also be in the part of digital or technology health. And I'll just use my mother because it's very easy. My mother now has a smartphone, which she can't use smartly, sadly, a normal phone, Google, a Duo, and iPad with all the functions. She can only use the normal phone. She's 86, and when the system goes off, as I think it was Jen that said, she kind of panics, presses one wrong button, and digital systems are, unlike humans, they're really unforgiving. Once you've pushed the wrong button, things go wrong, and then she freaks out and doesn't work. That's digital health, or basically non-health, because this is the way she can reach out for help. And how do I know that? A few months ago, I got worried because she wasn't at the predetermined call every Sunday night. So I called a neighbor, and they found her in a pool of blood because she had fallen and she had not been able to reach the fixed button on the wall. And she's a woman who has for 2 years refused to wear the bracelet. So bracelet and detecting the fall so that it would no longer be dependent on my mom is telemedicine. I've just downloaded the COVID alert app, which is another form of medicine, telemedicine, which does not need the HCP. And it's something we haven't touched upon. And I was expecting Jen to do so because it's about connecting patients to other patients. What my COVID alert app does is it registers on my phone, so my data securely, but I can't even access them. the code of all phones that stay within 1.5 meter or 5 feet from me for more than 15 minutes. It keeps all of those in its memory for 2 weeks. If in those 2 weeks, one of the owners of a phone like that tests positive, my screen turns red. I will never know who it was, but I'm helped by this novel form of digital medicine, which totally bypasses doctors and detections. Now I can enter the system. So I think it's a great debate, and I share the enthusiasm, but I also share a bit of the fear. It was great to hear about the human side. I was very worried a few weeks into the COVID crisis when I heard two comments. One from a friend of mine who's still in clinical practice, who said, Lola, I love teleconsultations. It's so amazing how efficient I can be now. I don't have to listen to patients anymore. So that was quite worrying. And and we can all look into our own bosom and say, it's so much easier to get out of a webinar or a tele meeting on the hour, or even with a false excuse, oh, sorry, I have to join another call, than it is to physically get up in a meeting, no matter how boring it is. So I think we'll have to, what we need most, I think, are two things which haven't been discussed. We need, and I think this is Jen's point, she's been hammering on it, I come back to it, sorry, Jen, to quote you so much, is we need to work more with patients to create guidelines, including as what constitutes good practice. For example, for teleconsultations, what's the minimum set of time? What is a good reason to have a teleconsultation and what is not, right? Those guidelines should come first. Then we need training. We need training both for healthcare providers and for patients. Patients also need to know that they need to prepare, because it's a short window and your body language is not going to be counting as much and there's no physical touch. So you better be prepared to use the time. Same for doctors. They need to go more in active listening. And then the third one, which is also something we haven't touched upon, is I think one of the greatest powers of digital is the built-in feedback loop. Imagine that after every teleconsultation, I get the very famous little 4 smileys that we all know because we see them everywhere except in health and in medicine, which is the green smiley, the light green smiley, the yellow smiley, and the red one who's really unhappy. And it's simply asking, how happy were you with this teleconsultation? The doctor doesn't need to know which patient it was, but will need at the end of the week or the end of the day, say how many patients, what was the score of the day. This kind of built-in feedback on data, but also on interactions, would help us to stay in check, I think. And maybe in function of time and letting the other panelists speak, I should stop there. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Lode. We have a question from the chat. Charlotte, I would love if you would respond to this. Do you think that the encouragement by doctors to buy home monitoring equipment will contribute to an even sharper divide between rich and poor in terms of outcomes?
This is a really interesting question, and I think it has hinged slightly on what Jen said about people's accessibility to this technology. Speaking within the UK, a lot of these devices would be provided to people regardless of whether they have the ability to pay for them. So within the National Health Service, historically, if someone has needed to have ECG monitoring for 3 or 4 days to pick up their own heart block, then that piece of equipment would just be provided to them on loan and they return it at the end. So there's no question about cost, or it's just not an issue. But I appreciate that if we go much wider than that into other countries, then that's not necessarily the case. And this technology will come at a financial cost that wouldn't be available or accessible to the wider population. So I think it has to be used very carefully. And I would be cautious about saying on that front we shouldn't use it, because it is there and therefore it should be used to maximize efficiency where we can, and we can learn a lot from that. Unfortunately, we do live in a world where there is going to be a degree of imbalance and it's always going to be playing catch up. But I think if we can provide that equipment where it's needed and at clinical, then that's probably where the focus needs to be. There are always going to be people who are going to buy this equipment back up, or a case in point, they're very, very expensive. I don't have one, but lots of people do. And that in itself will provide a lot of data. And in fact, as a healthcare professional working in clinical practice, I would have heaps of people coming in because they were worried about the data that was being collected on there and needed it to be checked. So there's another flip side to it, which is some of this data that's collected is going into patients who are not clinically trained and they don't understand the ramifications of it or the lack of ramifications, and it creates an element of health anxiety. So I think we need to educate around it. It's very, very easy to say, look at all this data. We can hundreds and hundreds of pieces of data, and as Jen said, what kind of data? But what do we do with that data? And whose hands is it going into? And depending on whose hands it goes into, it can either be positive or negative. So I think, to answer the question, yes, it can. It has the ability to create a greater divide, and therefore it has to be used very, very cautiously.
Gabrielle?
Yes.
Load here. I want to add, I think what Charlotte said was, oh, she's still talking.
No, she's okay.
Okay, it's just a delay with the. No, I think that's absolutely right. I just want to share an example of how it could work. I was last year invited to the first fully digitized GP practice in Beijing, China, which is a pilot project and would then be scaled up across the country, which is of course one of the big things that we haven't talked about is scalability of digital, which is a lot easier to do than enough people. And I saw two examples. One was proactive screening and appointment making. So the computer screens the health records of the 80,000 people that are in the practice. And again, it's for everybody that's in the practice, no inequity there. And detects that a certain child is now ready for a vaccination. The computer dials the phone number. An adult spoke up, it was on screen, it was live. And she said, and the computer asked, who are you, the mother of this child? She said, yes. Can you please confirm a few questions to make sure it was her? And I said, well, it's time for your child to come in for this vaccination. Are you okay with that? So the computer was checking whether she was okay with that. First, she was not okay because the kid was sick. And then the computer reassured her that for a sickness where it was no issue because the vaccine contained no living organisms. If she still was not happy, she could wait and they would call back. And the lady said, no, okay, then I'll come. Made the appointment. Everything was done with the computer. So that lady was going to come in. The second example was also by screening records. The computer dialed somebody and said, Mr. XYZ, it's been 6 months when we have a good check on your blood pressure and you are at risk. So we'd like you to come in and use your phone with the QR code that we're sending you now, and you will have for 10 days a home blood pressuring machine, which is calibrated. The first 3 days, the machine will be teleconnected via your Wi-Fi with somebody in our staff to help you use it well, and then we need 3 good days of measurement. After that, please bring it back by the 10th day. As of the 11th day, you're paying €1 rent per day, the equivalent of €1. And they had this whole wall, a little bit like our Google and Amazon package walls, with all these self devices, and people were constantly coming in, using their QR code, identifying themselves, and taking the home device, taking it home, and bringing it back. That was amazing to witness. The computer does not make a difference between whether you're rich or wrong. The decisions for health screening for the blood pressure were really solely made on data that were collected, but they were also very well collected. And at every time, that was the big thing that surprised me. The patient had the full screen of every data collected and said, do you agree that we upload these into your personal file within our healthcare practice? That was absolutely amazing. I think we can learn a lot from that. Just wanted to share that.
Thank you. So a follow-up question about this, actually, same topic, Tim, I'll bring it to you, which is, and this comes from our audience, with more monitoring and biometrics being captured at home, have there been studies focused on the mental health of patients with these digital interface? Perhaps knowing if patients become more stressed or more calm with more monitoring could help better individualize intervention, selection, and care.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And mental health issues are going to be one of the biggest causes for an interaction between a person and healthcare services, undoubtedly. So what we don't want to see is that technology makes that situation even worse. I think there's definitely a potential for some technology to increase anxiety. The false alarms, false alerts that lead people to think that maybe something terrible's happened when in fact it's just some glitch, something's gone wrong with the monitor. You know, for example, if you measure the blood pressure and something's gone wrong with the blood pressure machine, it tells you you've got a dangerously high blood pressure. That, of course, is very anxiety inducing. But I think there's also great potential for these technologies that we've been talking about to reduce anxiety, because you know, it's natural and right that as citizens we're all demanding more from our healthcare services. We know that there's so much that can be done, and sadly people still suffer ill health and die early because something hasn't been picked up or something hasn't been done in time. So I think that done properly, technology can help to reassure people that, you know, they are being monitored, and you know, if you've got high blood pressure, that for instance, you can be reassured that your blood pressure is under control, or if you've got diabetes, that your blood sugar is under control, and that you're not going to suddenly find out when you go to a visit to the clinic that there's been some problem and you've now got kidney problems because your diabetes is being badly managed or your blood pressure is being badly managed. So I suppose, like that's probably the answer to most questions with technology, is it can be good and it can be bad. It all depends on how it's implemented, which, you know, I think is the key message coming out of the session today, is that we've got to not adopt a one-size-fits-all plan for technology, that we've got to be very cognizant of the needs of each patient and not apply technology where it's going to be harmful. You know, so I loved Loda's description of the clinic in China, but some people might find that really frightening, but other people will love it. And we've got to make sure that that Amazon style of healthcare is used appropriately, but for the people who need the human touch, to Charlotte's point, and who might have visual impairment or dyslexia or some other issue that means that they can't interact with the service, have an alternative that meets their needs.
Great. So in our last 5 minutes, I would love for each of the panelists to comment on the following comment that was made in the chat by one of our participants, which reads, "There is no doubt that digital technology will increase health inequity before it will improve population health." So as a way to close our session, if you had a reaction or a call to action in relationship to this comment, again, I'll just read it one more time. "There's no doubt that digital technology will increase health inequity before it will improve population health." So Jen, let's turn to you for your closing thoughts.
Well, I just had a interesting little Twitter conversation about this maybe yesterday or the day before, when someone was liking telehealth and telemedicine to like the VHS and beta. And so what comes next being sort of laser discs. And my concern was, well, laser discs, that was not accessible to so many people. And so really that was not widely adopted, and, you know, increase the inequity from people who could have quality video. So how can we fast forward to get to the DVDs or the streaming services or the equivalent in telemedicine? So I believe that statement is absolutely true. My best, you know, charge and challenge for the audience and to all of us here is to just double down and do the work. I think this really comes down to when companies talk about being patient-centered. Unfortunately, I feel like I've been on a soapbox now to say, put your money where your mouth is. If you don't allot the resources and budget to do the work and make sure that you're understanding those populations that truly need these devices, then we're just going to continue to talk about these things and hold panels without actually moving the needle.
Thank you, Jen. Charlotte.
I also am inclined to agree with the comment. I think it's important to also just maybe controversially note, after what Jen said, that it is very much about the patients, but it's also about the healthcare professionals. And healthcare professionals didn't go into their profession to interact like we are now for day in, day out. They went in because they want to interact with people. So I think, as I said when I spoke earlier, if we can get to a point where we're giving people choice, then the people who can and have that access can use it if they want. And if it means that it allows healthcare professionals a little bit more time to give the healthcare provision to those who don't yet have access, then actually you could argue that then would that provide better healthcare to those people who maybe at the moment don't get that look in, because there is so much demand from so many people on so few healthcare providers. So if we can use that health technology to at least alleviate some of that burden off the healthcare providers by the people who can afford it, then actually that allows them to focus on those who can't, and maybe the more vulnerable. You know, as Lod was saying about his mother, then elderly populations do need to have that face-to-face contact. They do still need that. That's what they know, and that's what they feel confident and comfortable with. But when we look at children, you know, if we're having this conversation in 30 years' time, who knows? They'll probably be interacting via apps.
Yeah,
so
great.
Watch this space, I suppose.
Watch this space. Thank you, Charlotte. Tim, your final thought.
Yeah, well, I'm going to disagree. I think that technology doesn't necessarily need to worsen health inequalities before we see the benefits of population health. And the reason I say that is that it might cause some inequalities on a micro level, but at a macro level, if we look at global health, we simply haven't got the ability to respond to the growing needs of the world's population. And if you look at the amount of healthcare budget available to someone living in the developing world, it's a matter of a few dollars, whereas in the States or in the Western world, it's thousands of dollars or euros. And if you look at someone in Africa who lives far away from a health centre, they have virtually no health care services at the moment. So technology has the opportunity to allow someone in that kind of situation using a very simple handset to be able to get health advice where they wouldn't otherwise get it, or to have a vaccine delivered to them that otherwise wouldn't know they even existed. So I do think that it's not necessarily the case that technology will worsen health inequalities. I think it could actually be our saviour and a solution to the world's demands for healthcare.
Great, thank you. Lode, we're basically out of time, so just quickly, your last thought.
Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Yeah, I think the keyword for me would be act. I totally agree with Jen. Stop talking about it. And what it means acting more particular is work with patients to make sure that whatever you develop as a digital solution or digital service is actually more diverse than it is today. As just one example, we're in Europe going through wave 2 of Corona, which is entirely due to the wave 1 education and services totally missing big parts of the populations that are now the hotspots of wave 2. So if we don't really learn from those lessons, we will not eradicate this virus, because for once we need the whole population. So I hear what Tim said, but on the short run, what the examples you gave was actually increasing inequity rather than reducing it. So action with patients, that's the key word for me. I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So we want to thank all of our attendees today, and thank you for the rich engagement you gave us through the chat. We really appreciate the questions and insights that you offered. And thank you to our panelists. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.